Saturation is not a default. It's a conscious decision at all steps.
Oh, that's so important to add. Thank you for that. I have several saturation plugins on the mix bus. I always turn it off and A/B if I want it on or not. This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benediktine, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, man. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Summer is back here. We had horrible weather the last couple of days, but it's coming back today. It's a little more sunny, and
that's great.
Yeah, enjoyed some time outside today already, which is good.
Oh, awesome. I have exciting news. I almost got to play music with a band. It was a music video shoot, so we were kind of pretending to play, but it still felt amazing. It was the first time I'd been with like a band setting, even just in ages. I can't even, over a year for sure now, and it was so cool. I was the guitarist for the music video, and I had so much fun, even though my amp wasn't turned on.
Oh wow, yeah, it's a totally. I can totally relate. Like I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I had a similar experience at least. Like I joined a new band project. I can't really talk about it yet, and it's like nothing. Like it's in the very first phase of like doing it. But a friend of mine basically wrote, a whole record worth of songs, and he just needed people to play it with him. And we've been together in bands before, and like I really enjoyed the songs, and then myself and a couple of other people joined him. And we haven't really started other than making plans, but I already met with our drummer and helped him set up his room and the recording setup. And he listens to the podcast, by the way, and loves it and has improved his skills already a lot through it. So I at least had this one meeting and the feeling of like at least being close to making music again.
Yeah.
So I can relate.
Exciting. I didn't expect it to have that effect on me, but I've been like thinking about setting up a jam with friends of mine now, and it's like dangerous. I might get back into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, as we said before we started this, I'm a little careful as of now because it feels like we're slowly getting back to normal, but I don't know yet. So I don't want to be too excited yet because in 2 or 3 months it could be all over again. So.
Yeah, let's hope not. It's
exactly.
Definitely hope not.
All right, but other than that, I'm great, and it's like I booked a vacation for September, which is also good.
Fantastic.
To that. Yeah.
Are you planning to go anywhere? Are you taking that risk?
Yeah, we can cancel up until like pretty close to the trip. So we booked something that gives us this opportunity because we don't know. If everything goes well, we go to Italy.
Amazing. Beth and I were just looking at tickets to Italy yesterday.
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah.
So we'll see. Anyway, today, enough with the banter, because today we have a sort of a special episode because we asked people in our community to basically ask us questions that we can now answer on this episode. And it's a topic that you've requested in the community in the first place because, I think, what's his name? I have to look it up. Sorry for that. Sorry?
His name is Shay.
Shay. Okay, Shay, thank you for requesting that episode, Shay, because Shay requested an episode on saturation. And we think that this is a great idea because we haven't done one. And saturation is something we both love a lot and use a lot, both in recording and especially in mixing. And as we said, we want to dive more into mixing topics anyway. So this is a good start, I think, after last week's episode, which was already on that a little bit.
Totally.
And now, saturation is a very broad subject, and it can be very complicated depending on how you approach it. What we talk about. Like this is something we could go on for hours probably. So I decided to ask questions in the community, or to ask 4 questions from the community that we can answer specifically, and we'll go through those, of course. But we also want to give you a bit of an overview of what saturation actually is, the different forms it has, like the different types of saturation, and also some use cases and examples of how we like to use saturation, why we use it, the different tools we use. I think we should just start by giving people maybe a little bit of the definition of what it actually is, or how we we think it is, because I cannot guarantee that everything we say will be completely correct when it comes to the technical details, because it's a pretty difficult subject, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is like the practical use, the use cases, like how you can apply it. And I think we know enough to talk about that. So what is saturation?
Okay. First, before go into that, just for people that don't know what community we're talking about, there is a Facebook community called the Self-Recording Band community that you should go join. So that's where the question was asked. If you want to be a part of future questions and get to ask questions for other episodes and stuff like that, or even get links to sit in on episodes like this live while we do it and contribute to the conversation there in real time, go to Facebook and join the Self-Recording Band community. What's the URL again?
It's the selfrecordingband.com/community.
Easy. There we go.
I give you one more chance next time. Like, but you got it right last time, though, right?
I did.
I kind of forced you to say it, and you got it right. So
yeah, my brain just defaults to not remembering things in the morning. Coffee over here in Canada.
Yeah. So yeah, it's easy, and like the selfrecordingband.com/community. It takes you to the Facebook community, and this is the place to go. By the way, we are doing something new today that I think I have to mention it because you said it now, that people can like join us in real time. And you can only do that if you are in this community. Mm-hmm. At least for now, it's the only way. We are experimenting with streaming our recording of these episodes live to Facebook. So if you want to hear an unedited version of us like doing it live as we go, you can do that on Facebook for now. I don't know for how long we're going to do that. We're just experimenting with that. And that's what you can do right now. If you go to that community, you can see us do this live, and you can hear a more, longer, unstructured version of what you hear on the podcast app.
Totally. A messier version of us.
But you can see us being like doing this messy version.
Yeah, totally. Well, are people on the call right now, out of curiosity?
I think so. I think Richie already commented. Richie Edwin, he commented. And it says there are 2 people watching right now. So,
right on.
I mean, yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Cool. Yeah,
so,
totally.
That said, we won't pay a lot of attention to that stream. We'll just do our thing and get the episode recorded for you. We'll see what we do in the future. For now, it's more experimenting and giving you the opportunity to watch us, but we'll focus on doing the actual episode. All right. What is saturation?
Right. Okay. So about as technical as I can get with it is that saturation is what occurs when the input no longer equals the output. So if what is being output after something is input into any device, for as long as audio is concerned, that difference could be considered saturation. So the classic example would be going into an amplifier and turning it up so much that it starts to distort. And then now, obviously, the sound of your guitar is distorted coming out the other side. Or maybe not guitar. There's a lot of stuff going on in the guitar, but a vocal preamp or something. If you turn up the preamp too much, the vocal coming out the other side is clipped and distorted and saturated. So that is kind of the layman term of the layman technical example is that you have saturated the input signal by hitting stuff harder than it can manage, harder than it can, reproduce exactly.
Yeah, right. So the thing is, technically, every change to the original audio signal would be called distortion. So even a volume change is distortion. Mm-hmm. Like even if it's not clipping or saturating, it's distortion. That's a change that just is a change in volume is called a linear distortion. So that can be a simple volume change. It can also be an EQ that doesn't do anything other than like amplify a certain frequency range without like causing distortion. Mm-hmm. And whenever we are adding things that haven't been there previously, if we're not just amplifying things, but we're taking away, if we're actually adding things like frequencies that have not been part of the original signal, it's called a nonlinear distortion. And that's what we talk about when we talk about saturation. So we're adding frequencies that have not been there before. And those frequencies, if we talk about saturation and not like distortion, the way we use those terms, like we talk about usually a harmonically, like a pleasing sounding sort of saturation, and we add second or third order harmonics. Harmonics are multiples of the frequency you put in. So if you have like 100 hertz, the second order harmonics would be 200, for example. Third order would be 300. And or like for 50, it would be 100 would be the second order, 150 would be the third order. So all of these are musically related to the input signal. So they sound somewhat pleasant, but they have different characteristics. The second order ones are usually the most subtle and pleasant sounding ones because they are just octaves. And the third order ones can be perceived as a little more harsh. So they are related, but they are not as, we perceive them as less musical if they are getting very loud. And different types of equipment or plugins gives us these different distortion or saturation characteristics. And we usually call it saturation if it's subtle and quiet, and if it's getting really loud, or if the harmonics even get louder than the fundamental or the first harmonic, which is the actual frequency we put in, then we talk about distortion or hard clipping. Like everything below that is soft clipping, and hard clipping is when we turn the sine wave into a square wave, basically. And we have a lot of those third order harmonics. It gets harsh. It's like really noticeable, audible clipping. That's what we call hard clipping. And then the third order harmonics are dominant. And then there's like the mix of both. When we input a chord or like anything with more different frequencies, which is usually the case, you get both and they get mixed up. And it's like this dense thing that comes out the other end, which is partly related musically and partly not. So this is about as technical as we should get in this episode. I think what we can say is, as a practical thing right away, is that typically tubes give us if used in a subtle way, give us the second order harmonics, and things like tape has more of the third order harmonics, which can sound pleasing as well, but it's also a little more aggressive and upfront in the mid-range, whereas tubes are a little more subtle and smooth and musical sounding. So tube tends to create these second order, and tape these third order harmonics. There's also different types of tubes that have different characteristics, but again, this is too much for now. It's worth noting that not everything that has tubes in it is automatically saturating or doing so in an audible way, because good tube circuits actually are very transparent. So a tube, if operated correctly, applies a pretty linear change, like no non-linear distortion. Like good clean tube circuits are really clean. And only if you go past the range, they're like linear clean range, so to speak, they start saturating more. And they do that usually in a pleasing way, but only if you go past that thing, because people assume often that things with tubes in it automatically have this mojo and this saturation and this vibe. But that's not really the case. Some of the most expensive tube gear is actually very, very, very clean and transparent. That's why hi-fi people have these expensive tube power amps in their like hi-fi stereo systems, because they are super clean. And only if you drive them, they start to saturate.
Yeah. There's lots of mastering grade tube compressors and tube EQs and stuff like that. Tube headphone amps even that are just very clean, like you said. Not all of them. Yeah. On the other end, if you have like solid state gear and like transistors, basically, also, then if you drive those, their range is more like limited. They start to saturate at a certain point, but they quickly go into hard clipping and give you this more harsh, obvious clipping. Whereas with tubes, it's a gradual thing, and they don't break up immediately. They break up more slowly. And when you drive a solid state, like a transistor, this can have a sound as well that can be awesome, but it's like usually a more suddenly, like it applies it, more suddenly. And it's just all of a sudden it's there and it's obvious and it sounds like clipping. Right. So the main difference. And then there's transformers and other things that you can drive. Yeah, all of those give you different characteristics, and there's combinations, like a guitar amp that's supposed to drive your input signal to overdrive it. It's a combination of the tubes and the big output transformer, for example. Right. Yeah, totally. And if you picture like a console and your audio running through this whole chain of all of these different volume pots and EQ pots and stuff like that, there's potential for micro changes at each little point of that signal chain, right? Where it all adds up to a different non-linear result, like Benny said.
Yeah, totally. So I think at this point we should say that most people probably don't use the hardware stuff that we mentioned, but they use plugins. And those plugins are designed to emulate just that. So if you use a tape plugin, it creates, or it's supposed to create, the type of harmonics that tape would give you. And if you're using some sort of tube simulation, then it should do what tubes do. And if you use something like Saturn, like the FabFilter Saturn plugin, or something like very flexible like that, you can adjust it to behave like any of these things. Like you can make it sound like a transformer, or like tape, or like tube. And now the question, of course, that comes up is, when do you use each of those things? Like, where do you start? When do you apply saturation at all?
Right.
Because there's so many so many things, so many parameters that you can tweak, and
Totally.
so many use cases and different sounds. So where would you suggest? How would you suggest people should start exploring saturation?
Yeah. So I want to reiterate that while we just tried to kind of explain what it is, it's really not important as long as you know what your goal is. So you don't need to know that it's nonlinear or anything like that. That's like not important to the workflow. Really, saturation comes down to either I want to add some tonal mojo to something, right? So kind of shift how it sounds, or I want to control dynamics, and or both. It can definitely help with both of those. So when I think about wanting to saturate something for tone reasons, really my mind just says distortion. I want to distort it. And that could be very subtle or very extreme. But essentially that's my goal, is to make something fuzzier and less clean, and chop off the transients and round things out a little bit, right? And then alternatively, sometimes I want to just make things less dynamic and less pokey, and saturation is a great way to do that as well. And that can help with just make a less dynamic range in a source signal. Or it can help with getting the loudness of the mix up quite a bit. You know, when you've got these little micro saturations all throughout a mix on all these different instruments, you're going to gain quite a bit of volume potential through doing that. And that's something I do a lot of, is just little things that add up to a lot without the whole mix sounding like it's a distorted thing, right?
Absolutely.
For a use case situation, I'm wanting to do it for a tone reason or for a dynamics reason.
So that brings up another question, and that also got asked in the community, and that is saturation versus compression. What you just described is basically saturation, as we said, adds things that haven't been there before. They are usually, if done in a musical, subtle way, related to the music that you put in. So it's pleasing, and not necessarily, you don't hear it as something weird or strange. It just adds to the music, and it sort of fills in the gaps between frequencies that are already there, which makes the whole thing more dense and therefore more loud, basically. So if you want to use compression to make something more dense and loud, saturation can be an alternative, because what it does is it does it in a different way. Compression amplifies quiet things that are already there. And if you drive a compressor and it has components in it that saturate, it's a mix of both, because many compressors saturate and compress. But if it's a clean compressor, you amplify quiet things that are already there and present in the signal. If you use saturation, you do that as well, because there's a limit. Like, you chop off the peaks, as you said, and you saturate them. And if you then raise the volume, if you make up the gain for the gain change, then you increase what's quieter. So it's the same thing as compression, just with a very gentle curve, I would say. Mm-hmm. But you also introduce things that haven't been there before, so it's a more dense sort of compression. So you could say it's a form of compression.
Definitely.
But it sounds more dense and more energetic. And there's the danger in it as well, because it immediately gets louder, denser, and we often think it's better. But it also takes away from the clarity often. As everything gets denser, if you do that to every single signal in your whole arrangement, things will overlap, and it will maybe you have less separation, less clarity. And I think not everything can be very dense in a mix, or should be very dense. You have to decide, as always, with being intentional, you should decide what's supposed to be upfront and full of energy and dense, and what is very clear, defined, and whatever, mm-hmm. pan to one side or in the background or wherever. So you can't make everything super loud and dense, I think, or you shouldn't in most cases. That's the danger. And also through that shaving off the peaks and transients that saturation does, even if it's just subtle. It sort of smears the transients and the attack. So while that can be a pleasing and good thing to make things sound less pokey, like harsh, and things don't jump out as much, it also takes away from the clarity, because now you don't have that impression anymore that like all the little hits and transients and mouth noises and clicks and all that stuff that's in the music is jumping at you. You have less of that. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's just less clear if you do that. And if you overdo it, the mix can sound very flat. I've heard that a lot with where people oversaturated things in the mixes, and you immediately think it gets more exciting, but actually you're creating a very flat mix because nothing is really moving to the front anymore. Everything is like super controlled.
Nothing's pushing the speaker.
Yeah, exactly. That's the danger of it.
Now, something that's kind of fascinating about it is it can be, depending on how it's done, it seems to do different things, especially to different frequency ranges. Like clipping or just saturating high end sounds so different to me than saturating low subby bass content. Like if I distort the low end of a drum kit, things get like more flubby and very fat sounding, and it's pretty cool. Where if I do it to the top end of a vocal, it gets harsher. It's almost like the low end gets softer, but the high end can get harsher. And now I'm sure there's ways to do it the opposite, but you do have to be aware that different frequencies saturate differently to our ears, and I guess it's also the material that you're putting it on as well, right? Like if you're doing it to a more static instrument like a guitar versus like a transient instrument like a drum kit, it's going to be very different sounding.
Yeah, and also absolutely agreed. And also the type of saturation you use or the device you use. For example, if you've ever used a Pultec EQ or an emulation of a Pultec EQ, there is two versions of a Pultec. There is the tube Pultec and there's the solid state Pultec. Both of those saturate. Like I'm not talking about the EQ curves, that's a different conversation, but just their components, the tone of the box itself. It has a tone, and especially if you drive it, it like applies more of that. And the two versions sound differently. And it's pretty obvious to me actually if you make that comparison. If you use a tube Pultec, then the low end gets very resonant, and that is the I think it's the makeup amplifier in the end. Like it's a passive EQ, and in the end there is an amp to amplify the signal because everything before it is passive. So you need something in the end to bring the level up. And that amplifier, if that is a tube stage, in the case of a Pultec, this is pretty resonant sounding, and this is a very big and ringy sort of boomy sort of low end that sounds huge but not very controlled. If you've ever used a solid state Pultec, or some of the plugins have a similar behavior to the solid state Pultecs actually, it has a much more tight low end. So you get the same curve and the control and the features of a Pultec, but if in the end, the amplifier in the end does it in a more controlled linear way, and it results in a more tight low end, and it doesn't make bass drums woofy or boomy. And this is just, it also saturates and it sounds different and it sounds cool, but different. It's a different type of saturation. And that same thing is true with what you said with the mid-range and vocals, for example. Some devices, or the way you set a saturation plugin, such as Saturn or Decapitator or any of the obvious plugins, you can set it in a way that something sounds more edgy and aggressive in the mid-range, and you can set it in a way that it takes away the edge a little bit, depending on what you do. And I agree that most of the time, the upper mid-range or the mids in general tend to sound more aggressive. It's hard to really make that smoother with saturation. But if you go up higher, the top end, it's a different story. This is typically what gets smoother to me. Like sometimes I don't even need a de-esser if I saturate a vocal a lot, because like, I don't know, it's less, I don't know, less peaky, less annoying. It fills the gaps and it feels more smooth. And then sometimes I just need to turn down maybe the whole top end a little bit, and it sits right there after I saturated it. And you're right, it's a different behavior. Sometimes the low end and the top end get better, but the mid-range gets a little too aggressive, for example. Can be the case, I agree.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting thought, and it's like the sound of vintage recordings, which generally sound very like soft compared to modern things where like this wall of sound is hitting you, right? There's just all sorts of saturation going on throughout those recordings because of kind of like we mentioned, there's tape machines at every step of the process, so many tape machines, and the tape is getting older, which is saturation as well, right? And then all the consoles, it's all hardware, tube or transistor gear and stuff like that. So you ended up with these extremely saturated mixes, essentially, right? Even the mastering was adding a ton of saturation, which I guess still happens. That's a stupid thing to say. But anyways, very saturated. So you can kind of use that as like okay, let's look at some vintage stuff to figure out what saturation can sound like. Now, there's modern uses of saturation that don't sound as warm and smooth as that. Because I personally find a lot of old recordings to be too smooth. And then another thought I had while you were talking there, Benny, is that because we're saying that saturation can make things sound very warm and smooth and non-pokey like that, but think about guitars, where the more we distort them, the more aggressive they sound, and that is again like an extreme form of saturation happening. But obviously, it's adding aggressiveness rather than taking it away. Like a DI isn't going to sound heavy to us, right? But once we saturate it a ton, all of a sudden and it is again that mid-range that really jumps out and becomes this aggressive guitar sound. So it's interesting how it's just different.
Totally. But I think with guitars, this is also interesting that what you just said is only true up until a certain point. And if you go past that, like if you already have very distorted guitars and you turn up the saturation or the distortion even more, I think it gets less aggressive all of a sudden, because then the attacks and everything they are so smeared and like everything starts to sound flat again. Nothing jumps out. The attacks are gone. And then it's very distorted, but it doesn't really sound aggressive anymore. It's more like a pad sound almost. It's like so saturated and so dense that it is probably loud and noisy, but not necessarily aggressive to me. And like if you get it right, you have that aggression from the distortion, but you still have the pick attack and like the speakers moving, and that is also part of the aggression. And I think some semi distorted or like crunch sounds or like cleaner tones can sound pretty aggressive.
Oh, definitely.
Like if you have all the attack and everything there. A DI won't, you're totally right, but slightly distorted can be very aggressive. Whereas like totally too much distortion, overused distortion is not sounding aggressive anymore. That's also interesting because many people think the more they turn up the gain knob on their amps, the more aggressive it will sound. And many metal bands make that mistake. The not so experienced ones especially, and I've done that as well when I started playing in bands. I thought like the more I crank the amp, the more aggressive it's going to be. And all I was creating was this muddy mess that wasn't actually aggressive anymore. So
yeah. I guess once you go past allowing it to have that dynamic of a transient at all, right? It then loses all punch, which is so it's tone isn't the only contributing factor to a punchy sound. It's also the dynamics of the signal as well.
Yeah,
and you have to be careful because saturation affects both.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about a thing that you put in our notes here, and you've already touched on it a little bit, and that is you use it sometimes to make a tonal change. And we've talked about that a lot now, that you can make things smoother, more aggressive. You can bring in frequencies that haven't been there before. If you use multiband tools, for example, you can just saturate a certain frequency range instead of using EQ. For example, if you think it lacks upper mid-range and aggression and stuff, instead of like boosting the upper mid-range, you can use saturation in the upper mid-range and create the vibe that way. So it's an alternative to EQ, and we've talked about that now. You can control the low end, make it more resonant, tight, stuff like that. But there's another aspect of it, and that is to use it transparently as a way to, or not necessarily very transparent, but it can be, it can and can't. But to use it in a way like to control dynamics and transients, and doing that instead of a limiter, for example. And if we do that, we don't do it because of tone, or that's just part of it. And if you drive it hard enough, you will get a tone change. But it can be very transparent, actually, and actually more transparent than a limiter.
Yeah.
So you would think a limiter is a clean way of doing that, but it's not necessarily true. With a good clipper, or if you set it right, clipping can be super transparent, and it can. And I want to hear your thoughts on it, because you put it in the notes. To deal with those transients.
That's exactly what I'm doing. Is often using a clipper and you can really dial in the knee of a clipper to be a hard or soft clipper, and find that sweet spot where you're getting some more dynamic or less dynamic range actually out of your mix, without it sounding like it, right? So doing that just to shave off things in the right way will give you more ability to push the mix louder, if that's important to you, if it's something you want. I do that with a clipper is definitely. I think a clipper is kind of my go-to for like a transparent way, but that's where these like tape machine plugins do come in handy sometimes. They're going to, like you said earlier, introduce more harmonics. So it's more tonal, but it's still, that might not be the reason I'm grabbing it. I might be grabbing it because I want transients to behave differently. And there's also like these virtual console kind of plugins as well, virtual preamp kind of things that could also work. I'm a Sound Toys fanboy, so they have the radiator plugin that we both love, and I even use that on the mix bus sometimes. And it's like totally aggressive, but it really just pushes the transients differently. So you can do it on the mix bus, but I also am also doing it on like instrument buses or right on individual instruments as well. Just if only one thing's offending me, it doesn't have to be on the mix bus.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I think you have to be, and we'll get into that when we answer the questions, but I think you have to be very, very careful if you use it on the mix bus or even in mastering, especially in mastering.
Yeah.
But sometimes that can be cool too. So what I want to say is that there's two ways I think about this. The one way is if I use tape or something like Radiator or like these subtle or console plugins or something like that, sometimes this does what you just said and it controls the transients. Sometimes I even find that it even adds peaks and I have to do more limiting afterwards. It can happen.
Right.
Like you'd think it would like tame the transients, but sometimes with the frequencies the things are adding or the low end bump that you get from a tape machine sometimes, I find that I have to use even more limiting after it. So one example of this is the very popular Slate tape plugin, the virtual tape machines. If you ever put that on, even if you dial back it has an insanely noticeable low end push if you just use it in the default settings. So you have to use the built-in EQ to compensate for that because it's just insane the amount of low end that it adds. But even if you compensate for that, it still adds level and energy to the transients actually. So my limiter has to work harder if I use that plugin sometimes. So I still do it sometimes because I like the sound of it, but it doesn't what I thought it would do to control the transients. Other things do. But you got to be careful because I view these things more of as I want to add a certain tone or I want to add density or energy and stuff. If I really want to just attack or address the attacks, the transients, I usually go for a simple clipper plugin, something that doesn't give me a lot of options. Sometimes even just hard clipping. And what that does is I think there's a great. It was free, and if it's not free anymore, it's very cheap. It's called Little Clipper by Boz Digital Labs, I think it's called BOZ. A Little Clipper, it's a great plugin. It has one slider. You can slide between like soft and hard clipping and everything in between. And then you have an input and an output, and that's it. And if you set that to hard clip, like the same thing as that would happen if you just clip the output of your interface, for example. If you set that to hard clip and you just push it so that it takes off like a dB or two on a drum bus, for example, or on a snare, you don't really hear that, but it controls the transients. And it helps the limiter after it so that it doesn't have to work as hard. And the reason for that is if a limiter deals with transients, it pushes down on the transient and everything else in the music at that moment in time gets pushed down as well. So there's a little pump. So the limiter doesn't just push down the snare, it pushes down the whole signal and then it goes back up again. So if the limiter has to work very hard, you hear a pump and you hear distorting artifacts and it affects the whole signal. A clipper just chops off the top and everything else stays exactly as it was. So only the things that are as loud as the snare, they get affected by this clipping thing, and that's where the harmonics are added. So only the snare will cause, if at all, will cause an audible distortion. And because it's just a super fast transient, that distortion is not necessarily painful or harsh or annoying.
Or even audible at all.
Or even audible at all. It becomes part of the snare sound. Often it's even cool. It makes the snare sound fatter. Even it can give you a little more body. For example, for the snare, it can make it thicker and less pokey and thin. And also, what happens and that's interesting, what happens on the playback side, and that's why you gain a lot of level in a transparent way, is you chop off the top of the waveform So if you zoom in, you have this flat plateau. And if now a digital to analog converter, like your phone, your stereo, your computer, whatever, sees the waveform and it has this plateau there, it recreates that peak that was there before, and you'll hear the snare drum basically as it was. If you've done the mastering correctly and you prevented the intersample peaks and like you left enough headroom and all those technical things, if that's done correctly and if you have a good playback device, it will just recreate this peak. And I don't know how to say it. You just hear the snare as it was, basically. You have all the punchback, but the whole thing is louder and the limiter didn't have to work as hard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what basically happens when you clip. That's why a lot of mastering engineers use clipping to get that extra bit of loudness, because it's more transparent than mastering. Depending on the playback device, it can have like negative side effects. So a really crappy thing might clip audibly if you overdo it, or if you go to -0.1 or something. That can happen, but usually it's not audible, and you gain an extra dB or two of level. It might even add a cool character to the snare, and the rest of the signal is left untouched.
Totally.
So, and those are the two ways I think about it. One is just chopping off the transients, and the other thing is like slowly, gradually saturating everything and adding stuff in between what's already there.
Totally. Yeah, it's a classic example of clipping just being a bad word in the audio industry, where people are like, avoid it, but it's like, well, it's more clean than limiting, so we should do it. Now, it's funny, as we're talking about this, I'm like, this isn't very important to most of our audience who are just recording, right? Like, it's not something you really have to worry about, but I feel like it's a fun thing to understand.
Oh, totally.
And actually, you know what? I use it all the time on the way in. Now that I just said that, I totally take it back. I've got like a Neve style preamp in front of me. I push it hard, and I've got like the UA console version, the plugin version that I can record through as well. And you can push that hard, and you can saturate on the way in with these preamps. And it's totally a musical decision you can do on the way in. So I totally take it back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Saturation is totally a part of tracking.
Absolutely. And I think as like hardware compressors and EQs and stuff are also getting sort of popular again, and even affordable because of all those clones, like the Warm Audio stuff or the Clark Technique stuff and all this. Like, these boxes saturate. And I think a lot of people, even like DIY people, buy those things, use those things because they're fun to use, they sound great, and why not, you know? So we're all constantly, if you use things like that, we are constantly saturating stuff because those things saturate by default, basically. And you can do more of it or less of it, but we all do it, and we need to know when and when not to do it. And I think everyone who makes rough mixes even probably experiments with the saturation plugin at some point, because it's a production tool. It just sounds cool. It can be a certain effect for a certain part.
Oh, definitely.
And then there's the thing where I got it often when people get back the master and I send it to them and it clips or the red lights go on their side on the player. Then they are immediately worried and like they think something is wrong or someone made a mistake. And I'm not saying that every master should always like make the red lights go on, but it can happen, and it's not necessarily a mistake. It can be totally on purpose. So one example is Michael Agian, a mastering engineer that I work with a lot. His masters are super hot, but they are super loud, but they are super dynamic still. He does it in a way that I can't even. It's magic.
He's one of the best in the game for sure.
Yeah, and he's one of the best in the game at making things incredibly loud and powerful, but still dynamic and not squashed at all. But part of his workflow, obviously, or it seems to be, is that he likes to clip, and he doesn't really care about, like, not at least on every master. Some of the masters I get from him, he doesn't seem to care about, like, intersample peaks or clipping, as long as it sounds good. So if I listen to his masters and I don't look at any meters, I don't notice a single problem. It just sounds awesome. If I look at the meters, I might think, interesting. It clips by 0.5 dB or so. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it sounds great, and it does so in every single device. So don't get nervous if that is the case. It's probably done intentionally.
That's a great point. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Should we jump into some of these questions? Because we have some great questions.
Exactly. And that gets us, I think that will get us to the use cases automatically and to more practical stuff.
Definitely.
Like, go ahead.
All right. Well, let's start it off just in order, I think. First off, we had Ryan Flair, who said, I know typically drums and vocals get parallel distortion, but what other instruments get parallel distortion? Are there any? And I guess we kind of answered some of this, but well, I'll let you start it off, Benny. What do you primarily do parallel distortion on, or parallel saturation?
Yeah, I kind of answered it in the community, and what I said was basically that, first of all, I wouldn't say that there is anything typical about this.
Mhm.
What I said was that there are famous mixers who use parallel stuff on everything, and then there are other people who don't use parallel things at all, and both do amazing work. Like I mentioned two examples. Andrew Sheps is known for doing everything in parallel: saturation, compression, even EQ,
Yep.
which is kind of difficult and weird, but he does everything in parallel, or a lot of it. And then there are people like Andy Wallace, who says he basically uses whatever's in his SSL, and he doesn't really use parallel. He tried it, he didn't give him anything he thought he needed, and he doesn't do it. And both, I think we all agree that both of those are just legends, and they made insanely good sounding records. So there's no typical thing, I think.
Right.
Depends on what you're going for and what you like and how you like to work. So that being said, yeah, drums and vocals parallel distortion is, I think, relatively common. I think, and I added to that I think bass is pretty cool.
Yeah.
To do it. For me, I don't typically do it on drums in parallel. The reason is I usually, when it comes to drums, I use saturation or clipping just to tame and control the snare transients on the drum bus and on the snare channel itself, or the snare bus if I have one, just so that my bus compressor or the drum bus compressor gets a more even input signal. So I use the
Right.
clipper first, and I just chop off the peaks, and then after that I use my compressor, because then the compressor pumps in a very musical way, and it doesn't do these I don't know, if you don't do that, I find that sometimes it takes away 5 dB and then it takes away 1 dB, and it's like very inconsistent. If I insert a clipper before the compressor, it's more even and controlled already, and I
Yep.
get this extra loudness push. And if I do that on every single bus just a little bit, then my final bus compressor or master limiter or whatever doesn't have to work as hard. So on drums, I do it not in parallel, but on the bus itself. And that the same is true for anything transient heavy, I feel. Like with vocals, it's the same. I use it on the bus itself. I want to control the transients. I want to saturate the vocal as a whole and just dial in the amount that I like. That's just how I do it. And I feel like I want, with things like transients and vocals, I don't want any messing around with the phase at all. So I don't want to even run into the risk of doing that. So I feel like I get the most true and upfront and clear and crisp sounding thing if I just do it on the bus, and let the transients as they are, and maybe control them just to the degree that I want. With things that are more like a pad, or more like less transient heavies, things like organs, for example, like or Rhodes, or like Hammond organs, Rhodes, or even bass, for example, stuff that has long sustained notes that I want to saturate. I do it in parallel more often because I don't care as much about the true representation of the transients.
Right.
So I'm not afraid to use parallel stuff as much, especially like saturation. I use parallel comps all the time, by the way, but saturation, depending on the tool you use, it has maybe filters. It might have built stuff into it that can cause a phase issue, and so that's why I'm very careful with doing it with transient material.
And it chooses
like,
more of a smear.
Exactly. So, but with bass, I like it. With organs, I love it. With Rhodes, I really love it. Like that sort of stuff. I really love parallel distortion. I really love to really distort it in parallel, like go crazy, and then just blend it in a little bit. That can be super awesome.
Definitely.
So yeah, there's that. That was basically my answer to that. And as always, there are no rules. Like if you like distortion on something, try it on the channel and then try it in parallel and see what gives you better results. Maybe
Definitely.
the phase change is actually cool. Like there are no rules, so I wouldn't say there's anything typical. But if you ask for the most common things, then I'd say drums, vocals, and probably bass.
Yeah, totally. I just kind of, I think we're very similar in how we work with this, so I don't really have anything to add. It's like I try to use the buses whenever possible. Always being conscious about phase, but yeah, the same as you. So we'll just move on to the next question, I think. And you answered Ryan's next question, which was about phase, and so that's answered.
Just one more thing I want to add to that, but it's very short, just to make clear what I mean. If you pull up something like the Decapitator, or probably any sophisticated saturation plugin that you have, there's going to be filters in it. And sometimes, even if they're all the way to the left, they are still in there. They're not off sometimes, even if they're set to 20 hertz or something. And if that's the case, this built-in filter causes like a phase shift, and that in parallel can mess up things. And that's why I'm very careful with that. So only if I know that there's no filter, nothing happens to the phase basically, then I'll use it. But I'll have to try. So I stay on the safe side. Okay.
So that's only an issue with multi-source situations, right? So if you're doing it to just like the snare, and now your snare's phase relationship has shifted against everything else, right? Where if you do it on the drum bus itself, you're shifting the phase relationship of the whole image at once, so it doesn't matter. Everything's changed equally.
Yeah, except for if you do it in parallel. That's why I was saying, that's the thing. Because in parallel, you have the parallel channel against your drum bus, and if you introduce the phase shift on one but not the other, then it gets messy. So that's what I...
Right, yeah.
Because the question was about parallel. But you're right. If you do it on the drum bus as a whole, it doesn't matter. And that's exactly the reason that what you just said. Yeah, totally. Okay, so how much saturation is too much saturation?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dominique, for the question. This is a question I try to answer every mix almost. I push it so far sometimes, and then sometimes I have to come back. Sometimes it works. I recently did a mix. I'm going to give a shout out to longtime podcast listener Chris Erickson, and his artist name is Scove, and we did a mix for a song called Dark Ice. If you want to check that out on Spotify, it's SKOV. I distorted everything. And honestly, I think it sounds amazing. It's like one of my favorite mixes I've ever done. I've got L1 literally maxed out on the bass. Just all the way it could go, as much L1 as I could get. And so there's so much distortion going, but for that song, it just works. I swear, it just, no matter what I did, I could do no wrong. And I distorted all the drums, the bass, the guitar, the vocals, the synths, everything's distorted. Still sounds great. So as much as you can is the answer to that question for me.
Yeah, totally. I literally answered with a sticker, with a photo of a sticker that I have on my desk that says "distort everything," and that's sort of what I live by. Like I just like distortion, so I probably overdo it a lot, and then I have to go back. And
I've had to go back. I had a very polite mix note from a band once that said, "Hey, I don't know if something went wrong on the bounce out, but it's all very distorted." And I was like, well, yeah, that's meant to be. And then I listened to it again. And I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty bad. Every once in a while, I think we had this conversation when that happened on the podcast, where we like to wait one day so we can listen to it with fresh ears the next day before we send it to the client. And that is exactly why, because you get stoked as you're doing it, and you're like, oh, more.
Yeah, totally true. So hard to answer this question. So I think I answered it by saying, I try to be, as always, pretty intentional.
Yeah.
And I try to not go back and not, sometimes you have to, but I try to only move forward and not undo what I've done before. So I try to think first why I want to do something, then I just do it, and then I move on. So I try to do not as much experimenting, just because it takes a lot of time, and sometimes I end up somewhere where I have to go back anyway. So I don't know, I just like a plan and only move forward. So what I do is I think about, I have a sound in my head that I want to have, and then I choose the tools that I think will do the job, and I'll saturate till I get there. I might have to try 2 or 3 tools, but I get there. And if I turn it up more and it doesn't give me any more of what I wanted to do in the first place, if it doesn't get me closer to the sound that I had in my head, then I know that it's too much. So I dial it in, I turn it up until I feel like I get what I wanted. And then there's this point where I don't get any more of that. It just gets different. It just gets like, I don't know, harsh, or there's unwanted side effects, or I get things that are maybe cool but not what I wanted. And at that point, I just stop. And I think you have to train that and learn that. Yep. But it's really all about like knowing why you do it in the first place, being intentional, and just listening carefully. So you reach that point where you don't get any benefit from it anymore.
Yeah, and different genres and songs will demand different amounts. You know, we work in pretty rock-orientated, distorted genres primarily, but there's totally genres where they want clean, so you have to keep things more transparent.
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay, and by the way, Dominic is a great mixer producer himself, so I need
So his answer
to
is
tell you that.
also as much as you can.
Probably like he works in the pretty extreme metal genres, so his
Oh,
mixes
cool.
sound like evil, like as fuck, and like like really heavy and low tuned stuff, and like so he knows what he's doing, and he's probably saturating a lot as well. But
Great.
also, I'd love to hear from you, Dominic. By the way, you can just comment in the community if you have ever listened to this or see this, because in the types of mixes that you do, sometimes if I work on music like that, I find I have to be very careful actually with saturation because things are so dense. Like if you work with blast beats, down-tuned guitars, heavy distortion on the guitars already, probably a pretty gnarly bass tone and all that, and everything in like doubles and layers and stuff. And it's a very dense, fast arrangement
Gets too thick.
in a metal song like that. There's little room for additional saturation often. Sometimes you have to keep things really clean in the mix because it gets messy otherwise. But I'd love to hear your opinion on that because you mix way more very extreme music than I do, I think. So
Totally.
yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay.
I'm going to let you answer this next one because I should have gone to the washroom before we started recording this. So I got to run. But I'll read it out for you. How do you go about saturating your master project to create distinctive analog compression effect caused by tape machines such as the J37, which is there's a famous Waves plugin replicating that.
Totally.
You're wrong.
So, so I'd say it's an interesting question. So, as I said, I would be very, very careful on the master bus. I know there's this thing where people mix and master in the same session, and that's probably what you do. I don't know. To me, sometimes I do it. Sometimes I like to separate the mastering from the mix. And even if I do it in the same project, I think of it as two different stages of the process. So what I do is I try to create all the character and vibe and tone that I want through saturation. I try to do that in the mix, even if that means processing the mix bus, but it's still the mixing phase where I think about these things. And I try to do it on buses or individual channels rather than the mix bus a lot. So I can really focus on individual things and apply it only to the things that need it. And then on the mix bus and the master, I try to stay very transparent, actually, especially in the mastering. So if the mix is done well, the function of the mastering is basically to make it translate well to all the different formats and platforms and playback systems, and also to apply a final polish, maybe to correct some minor problems, maybe to make it a little more dense, make it louder, or maybe make it more dynamic sometimes. Whatever it is, but it's always, the goal is always to stay true to the mix. So I'm very careful with saturation on the master. But that being said, if I want the mix to be denser, if I want to glue it together, then yes, I would use something like that. I would use something like a tape set plugin or a tube plugin or a hardware box, whatever gives me the sound I want. And but if I do it, it's very, very, very subtle. And if I need to do it in a drastic way, I go back to the mix and do it there, or I ask the mixer to send me something that has actually the tone that they want. Because if I do it on the master, I might affect things that don't benefit from the saturation. Now, I also think that there's no such thing as a distinctive analog compression effect because it's all just different tools. Some plugins sound more quote unquote analog to me than actual analog gear. And some analog gear sounds very transparent. So I don't think that these days there is a distinctive analog sound. I know that it sounds very appealing and people like to believe the whole mojo thing, but I also think that people blow it way out of proportion. And I think that analog is not always better, and it doesn't always have a vibe and a character. It sometimes has, but not always. And it's just tools that sound differently. So yeah, that's it. And basically, and if you ask about the J37 and tape machine plugins like that, what they do to me is they add density. They change the low end. It can be more boomy and full. There's this low end bump that tape machines have. But depending on how you set it and what you use, it can also make the low end a little tighter. It can add harmonics that make the low end more audible on small speakers, which is a whole function of saturation in and of itself. It can smooth out the top end a little bit. And it can make the upper mid-range a little more edgy. So the thing we've been talking about before, that you get a smoother top end, so cymbals and S's maybe, but you might get more aggression in the upper mid-range. and then you change the low end to whatever the tape makes it sound. And if I want any of that, I use a tape, but very subtly. Yeah, but and then you asked the follow-up question, Julia, where you said, would you use rather software or hardware saturation in that case, either mixing or mastering? Totally depends. You can get by with only plugins these days, absolutely. But if you have hardware, you have to do a shootout probably if you don't know your gear already that well, because there's no other way. Because I have analog tools and I have digital tools, and I don't prefer one or the other. I just shoot them out, or I have done it a lot in the past, and I know what those sound like. So I know in a certain situation what I want to use to solve the problem that I want to solve. So there's no better or worse here, or no recommendation that I can give. But if you have a certain plugin or box that you know what it sounds like and it fits the situation and solves the problem you want to solve, then just use it. And in the beginning, I think you have to do a lot of shootouts and experimentation. And because tastes are different as well, like 3 different people will give you 3 different opinions on a piece of analog gear or a plugin. That's just how it is. And yeah, so this is my long answer to it. The shorter one can be found in the community. Thank you, Julia. It's a great question, though. And I think to sum it up, if you want to add glue to the mix bus or the master bus, then using a saturation plugin in a subtle way can be a great way to do it. Just don't overdo it. And what I think you mean with distinctive analog compression is probably the gentle saturation and compression curve and the glue and the density that you get from that, which is not necessarily an analog thing, but I know what you mean. So if that's what you're going for, yeah, tape can be the way to do it, but sometimes it's not. All right. Malcolm, take the next one. What do you listen for with clipping? Nick asks this. And I don't know. I don't even try to pronounce his last name. Sorry, I can't speak French. Do you know how you pronounce that, Malcolm?
No, I'm on the wrong side of Canada for correctly saying anything French.
Gourmand, probably?
Probably.
Anyway, Nick, your question is, what do you listen for with clipping? Is it different for an individual channel versus the mastering chain?
Thank you for the question, Nick. So for clipping, now it's funny, this might just be me, but for terminology, when I'm thinking clipping, I am thinking strictly about chopping transients. I'm not really thinking about the saturation side of things, which, I mean, it is saturation, but when my mind thinks saturation, I'm thinking tonal distortion stuff, right? So clipping, I'm just like, okay, we're cutting stuff out to make more or less dynamic range, I guess. But it's interesting. I want to clarify that because I keep flip-flopping on that. But what I mean is we are lessening the dynamic range of what we are clipping to create dynamic range or a dynamic headroom for our limiter, right? Because now there's more space for us to push the limiter without it having to work as hard. So that clears that up. But anyways, to your question, Nick, what am I listening for when clipping? And again, thinking about it as chopping things, I'm really listening for bad distortion, especially on the mastering bus kind of thing. If I'm clipping, I want to essentially not hear it usually. In a clip with a clipper, I'm trying to just chop, like Benny said, the snare is generally the thing that's peaking louder. So I'm trying to just hit those so that my limiter can have an easier job and be a little cleaner. Is it different for an individual channel versus the mastering chain? I don't really think so. I think it's about the same for me. I'm trying to, again, accomplish the same thing without it having a negative type of distortion. Is it the same for you, Benny?
Yeah, totally. I don't think about it very differently. I if at all, I'd say like as I said, I'm more subtle on the mastering chain usually. Mm-hmm. But
I will add that on the mastering chain with a clipper, definitely be careful that your kick isn't the one distorting.
Oh yeah.
That seems to be an easy thing to go wrong.
Yeah, and that I think we should add a little thing here that we've didn't talk about in the beginning, but it's very, very important, and that is what you just said. Clipping and low end are 2 things that can or can't be a good thing together. Like it can be like, the thing is, if you saturate low end, it tends to sound smaller, so it takes away from you lose subs typically. The low end has the most energy. It's the first thing to clip unless you have a very loud snare, as you just said, or something. But usually the low end is very sensitive to clipping the long wavelengths. And if you clip them, they are not sounding like low waves anymore, like because they are distorted. They are not these huge, beautiful sine waves that sound full and like low end. They are now divided into like little waves that you still hear that it's a low note, but it doesn't sound as big and full anymore usually. So sometimes this can be good to control the low end to make it a little tighter. It can also be used, and it's a good thing if you use it that way, to make low end audible on smaller speakers. So sometimes it's a very good thing if you saturate the bass, for example. And especially if you do it in parallel, for example, you have one channel that has the full low end and you have another one with the harmonics, and those harmonics can be reproduced on a smaller playback system, and now your brain hears those harmonics, and there's this thing called the missing fundamental effect, where we hear only the harmonics, but our brain knows what the fundamental to those harmonics is, and we add it in our brain. So we hear the low end even though it's not there. So harmonics and saturating low end can be a great way of making a low bass line audible on small speakers, for example. So there's that. But if you don't want that, if you don't do that intentionally, it can cause a lot of problems, because if the bass drum, as you just said, Malcolm, if that's the thing that's clipping on your master bus, you'll probably lose, absolutely lose clarity. It will sound like it's just clipping in a bad way, just like you overdrive the playback device or something. It just sounds like crackling noise usually, and it also it makes the low end smaller, and it causes pumping sometimes. So usually on the master, that's not the place where you want to saturate the low end a lot, unless you do it intentionally, I would say,
Right.
at least. So
Yeah. Be especially conscious of this if you're doing like any kind of hip hop, rap, or something like that. Was big 808s tends to go poorly.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my opinion.
Cool. Yeah, totally. You're totally right. Totally right. I don't mix a lot of that, but it's absolutely. It's the same, by the way. If you don't mix or record or produce electronic music, but you do metal or modern rock, and you use things like bass drops or any of those effects, this can really happen there, and you might not even notice. You might just listen to the master partially, and you might not maybe skip the part where the 808 drops or this bass drop sample comes in, but you absolutely have to check those, because those might cause crazy things with your saturation and limiting, and maybe you need to send them around your mix bus or something, or do some weird tricks to make it work. So be careful with that.
Definitely.
Okay, next question is Corey Stopper, and he says, I hope I didn't butcher that name as well, but Corey says, is it better to use different saturations on different instruments, or the same across tracks, or just one on the master bus? I'll give that to you as well, Malcolm, because you've been talking about console plugins.
Right.
And this is, I think, an application of those. Like, you could have the same console plugin on every channel, or you can have that plus a mix bus plugin on the mix bus, or you can just have the mix bus plugin. So what do you think? Is it good to do that, or would you use a different console or different saturation plugins on each channel?
So I remember when the Slate Virtual Console first came out, it used to have like a bunch of different settings for different iterations of different channels, so that each instance would be slightly different, which would try to replicate more so a real console where each channel would be different. I mean, that's cool. I don't do that. It seems like a lot of work. I strictly just, if I want something to sound different, I'm going to throw something on it. And you just learn your gear. I know what that Slate one sounds like. I know that the Shadow Hills by Brainworks mastering compressor has these virtual different channels as well, and that you can actually change those as well. And very occasionally, I'll click that button to just randomly choose different ones. It's just like, give me some magic. It's a luck thing.
Yeah.
But I don't really try and set up my sessions to be like a console. It's just, I don't think it's really necessary. It's more so learning what each different type of saturation accomplishes. So like Decapitator is very different than Saturn, two different distortion plugins, right? And I think they sound extremely different. So I'm going to grab them for different reasons. Just like a clipper is going to sound different than a tape machine plugin. They're just different tools for different jobs, and you just have to experiment with them until you know what they do, and then you'll just start intuitively reaching for the one you want / need. Agreed.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that?
Not really. Other than that, yeah. So it's normally different across tracks.
Cool.
To answer the question more thoroughly.
Cool. Okay. So my quick thoughts on this, on these are, I'd say it can go both ways. It can be beneficial to use the same sort of subtle vibe on all the tracks, like with a console plugin, and then it adds um, this density or subtle glue, and it adds up because every single channel is very subtle. But if you do it across like 50 channels, you get that vibe from that console maybe, and the same sort of saturation, which maybe glues things together. So that can work. It can also go the other way because if you apply the same type of saturation to every single instrument or channel, it can sometimes things will sound a little, to me at least, sound a little more narrow even, or I don't know. I feel like I'm lacking clarity and separation, and like things like the Brainworks plugins, the Plugin Alliance consoles, where you can have different channels of the same console. That is the workaround for that, because that doesn't happen. Then you have the same vibe, but not exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
But if you use exactly the same thing, like something that doesn't give you different channels, but it's the same channel on every, or the same plugin on every track, then you have the same distortion, which is not the case on a real console. And then things can, I don't know, I think it just lacks clarity and separation sometimes. That can even happen if you use the same EQ on every channel. I sometimes use different EQs just for no real reason other than I want to use different things to avoid applying the same curves and the same saturation and the same characteristics to every single thing. Because I feel like if I use different things, sometimes things get wider, more separated, more, everything has its own character, and there's more clarity to me. So, but if you use things like that give you different channels, or as you do, Malcolm, just use different plugins, then you don't have that problem. So I agree there. What I will do though is I have different mixing templates for different sort of vibes that I'm aiming for. So I have my Neve template, my SSLE template, my SSLG template, my J template, and I know what those sound like. And only part of it is the saturation because it's very subtle. Most of it is actually just the way the EQ curves work, or in case of the Neve, it's a more drastic difference. But I just learned how those console emulations sound, and I know when I listen to demos that this template probably works better than the other one.
Oh,
So
cool.
I just decide which console I want to mix things on, and it's a subtle thing, but I don't know. It just works for me. Part of it is the saturation, but mostly I think it's just how the curves work or how the mid range sounds. If I boost something, the E sounds
Right.
much more aggressive to me than the J, for example. So if I know I want to have something really edgy and aggressive, I go for that. If I want to have something modern polished, I go for the J or whatever.
Right.
So I totally agree with you that different channels are, plugins are usually what I'm aiming for. And I have in my template on every track that I could probably saturate, I have a selection of different saturation plugins ready to go that I can
Right.
just quickly audition. I assume you do the same. So on my drum bus or on parallel buses that I use to crush things, there's 2, 3, 4 different favorites, and I
Yeah.
just quickly go through them and see which one I want to use.
Yeah. Yeah. And usually I bet you get it right on the first one. It's like, because we know what they sound like, right? You get good at it. I one thing I want to read between the lines on with Corey, and maybe you're not saying this, Corey, but I think there is an assumption that we're meant to have one of these virtual consoles on every channel. And that like that's part of mixing, and that so these little faux analog things are like a part of a good mix, and I absolutely disagree. I think it's, again, you have to just listen, and if it sounds like it needs something like that, that's when you put it on. It doesn't have to be there as a default. Always remember that how things recorded, it might already be saturated enough. And there's lots of music like kind of more modern hip hop stuff where it sounds really cool, where it's just like all digital and clear and stuff like that. Even some metal sounds really cool like that as well. So saturation is not a default. It's a conscious decision at all steps.
Oh, that's so important to add. Thank you for that. I have a saturation plugin on several plugins on the mix bus that I can audition, and one of them is my favorite that gets used almost always. It's the Black Box plugin by Plugin Alliance. I just love how that sounds on the mix bus. But I always turn it off and A/B if I want it on or not, because it's pretty drastic the way I use it. And as you said, often I like it, but sometimes the mix doesn't need it, and I wouldn't know if I didn't compare it because I'm so used to it. That's just the way my console, quote unquote, my digital console sounds if I put it through that, and I'm used to that. But I have to turn it off to see if it really makes things better. And sometimes if I use all these console channels, for example, as I said, there's a dial on them where you can turn down the harmonic distortion on those all at once. So I'll do that. I'll disable the distortion on all those channels at once and see if it's better with or without it. Most often it's very subtle, but sometimes it's pretty audible as well. And sometimes I keep the consoles, but I turn off the distortion and just use them for the EQ curves. And sometimes I like their distortion and I even increase it. So it's absolutely intentional, and I would not use anything just because you have it or because somebody uses that console. I don't. That's the advantage we have these days. I mean, if you were mixing in the 90s on a real SSL, you have no choice. You have that SSL. And if you didn't like the sound of it for a particular mix, you'd have to work around that. That was part of the skill that people needed to have. They needed to know when the sound of the console is actually cool or the sound of the tape machine, and when they had to really fight the console or the tape machine because they didn't want the saturation. That happened often. And we have the luxury of not having to deal with that because if we don't want it, we just don't use it. And then it's absolutely crystal clear. So
it's pretty cool.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we both got a lot of mixes or stuff to mix or stuff to master where we think like they shouldn't have used that on default. It's just oversaturated or So
it happens.
That. Cool. All right. Last question. Jeremy Pothoff. Jeremy, you said, how about saturation on acoustic guitar? Oh, good one. What are some ways to do this and still have it sound like an acoustic? My first thoughts are doubling the track, clean left, distorted right. Interesting. And EQ. I heard a local guy do it live once with great results. I've never been able to replicate it live or record it. Okay, I'll leave that one to you, Malcolm. You do more acoustic guitar than I do. It's like a more Canadian thing, I think. but I know that you do more of that than I do. So I know that saturation, and I like it on acoustic guitar, is cool. It can be cool. Better than compression, at least I think so often. But that's about it. So I'm particularly interested in the whole left-right thing. I don't know. I've never done that, but
I've never done that either. I wonder, like, does he mean recording a left and a right performance, so separate performances, and changing one side? I honestly, I'm not sure about that method, Jeremy. It's something I've never tried, and it seems odd when I think about it. But maybe it's cool. You never know. So with acoustic guitar, it's very dependent on, for me, it's very dependent on where it lives in the mix. If there is drums, an acoustic guitar usually becomes a percussive instrument where you are focused on the transient pick attack being a rhythmic tool that sits with the drum kit, because really that's all you can hear. I mean, you can make out the rest of it, but like it is not doing a great job at the low mid stuff or even it's like bass guitar and drums, and normally there's an electric guitar that gets in there too that just do a better job at filling those spaces usually. And so my focus becomes that transient stuff. So you can use saturation to soften that, to make it less zippery sounding. For example, it's a great way to fix DIs. If you're stuck with using a DI acoustic, you can kind of mess with that. I don't reach for distortion tools. Again, this has been a tricky episode because saturation is a form of distortion, right? But for terminology, distortion, we normally mean, like something that something that really causes distortion. So I'm going to reach for something cleaner, I guess, like going back to a tape machine or going back to Sound Toys radiator, which actually I wouldn't say is a clean thing, but it isn't really a distortion box either. It's just going to warm things up. That's kind of my goal often, is to warm up the attack so that it's not so zippery sounding. I'm against zipper acoustics.
I agree. And by the way, you don't have to boost an insane amount of top end on acoustics. I don't know why people do that so often. Like, so many acoustic guitars are so like way too bright. And yeah, I agree with everything you said. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. The left-right thing, I don't know. I assume that you probably got something wrong there, because I can't imagine a live sound guy putting a clean one on the left side and the distorted one on the right side, or like. And because you said that live, I think you mean not really doubling it, but like an artificial double, like So I'm not really sure what you mean there, but even if you do an artificial doubling effect or you copy and paste the track or whatever, it would be weird to me to listen to an acoustic guitar, especially in headphones, and have totally different things left and right. And also
Right.
live. I might be wrong, but I'm not sure you got that right from that live sound guy, or I don't know. But maybe like tell us more about it. Like comment in
Yeah.
the community and tell us what you mean by that, and maybe it's something cool that we need to explore. But it's definitely not something common and not my first thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, live is primarily mono in a lot of setups. So it'd be odd to try and make a setup where you've got this stereo thing going on, and then you arrive at the club and they're a mono system. You'd be kind of screwed. I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be cool though.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I don't know. Okay, that's about it, I think. I hope this was helpful because, yeah, there are so many things that we could talk about when it comes to saturation. So I hope we covered the most important part. Being intentional, as always, I think is important.
Mhm.
Knowing that different types of saturation exist, that there's hard clipping, soft clipping, maybe read up those things. Like we'll put it in the show notes if you go to the selfrecordingband.com/76. You'll find the show notes, and I put some explanations, and I found a great like Wikipedia article on it that I'll put there. And I found some other, I think Sonarworks has a great article on their website about it. So I put those there, those resources for you to look up the technical things. And yeah, it's important to know that different devices give you different characteristics of distortion and saturation. And then I think it's a matter of learning what those different types of saturation sound like. And then you get a feel for when they are appropriate or not. I think that's the way to do it. You just, first of all, you need to learn what it sounds like, what the gear you have sounds like.
Right.
And then just see if it fits a certain situation or not. And it comes with experience, I guess. It's one of those things that I think you just need to do over and over again in order to really understand it. So, but being intentional is the most important. And when in doubt, I would leave it off, honestly.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is if you insert a saturation plugin because you think it's what you do or what you've seen someone else do, and you can't really confidently say that it makes things better, but you just assume you got to use it, then turn it off.
Yeah. Agreed.
That's, I think, a rule of thumb that you can really follow because often it's just not needed. And if you can't say for sure that it improved the thing, turn it off because it might have caused problems that you're not able to hear yet or that your speakers can't reproduce. And if it didn't make things better, why do it? And on the recording side of things, we didn't talk about that a lot, but I think the same thing is true. Just see what your gear does if you push it to the limits. Even if it's just a cheap interface or preamp, just see what it does if you crank it. Might be cool, might not
Could
be,
be.
but just know what it does. You learn when it starts to get problematic. You learn how to dial it in so you don't get past that point that causes problems.
Yep.
You can try fun things with all sorts of pedals. We've talked about that, or just weird things that distort. We've recorded guitars through, what's the word in English for those little those voice recorder things with the small tapes in it?
Oh, like a
voice
little
recorders
cassette thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a.
Those
I
things
know what
where
you're
they
talking
used in offices back in the day just to dictate things.
Yeah.
Those. We had one of that lying around at a friend's place, and we just plugged our guitar into that and cranked it, and then recorded the output and checked what it sounded like, and it was a crazy sort of distortion that was actually pretty cool. So at least we thought it at the time. But you can experiment with all sorts of gear and just see what it does, and
Definitely.
most of it, especially cheap stuff, will distort in a way, and you'll learn so much by doing that. And maybe after this episode, you can be more intentional and you actually know why things sound the way they sound. I at least hope so.
Yeah, totally. Again, if you're not sure, leave it off. And a lot of those examples, actually, you have to really be sure. Like if the cheap preamp thing, for example, cheap preamps generally sound worse as you crank them. Like for modern preamps, if it's an old thing, it might be it's going to be a very different effect. But don't get tricked by the loudness is all I'm getting at, kind of thing. Because you're turning it up, it's getting louder. You might perceive that as better. So be careful.
Totally. Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's it for this episode, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye.